Today, in preparation for my next literature video on one of the most significant writings from the one and only Mao Zedong, revolutionary leader of the People's Republic of China for its first 27 years and Marxist theorist, in my opinion, of similar significance as both Lenin and Marx themselves. In order to understand his contributions, today we're going to be diving headfirst into one of the crustiest parts of Marxist theory and discussing the immortal science of Diamat. Hello and welcome to Simply Radical, your personal ticket to understandable radical left-wing theory. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you'll stick around for a bit. Most of my videos here are summaries of books written by authors better informed than me, from an MLM perspective. Sometimes I also make videos about specific ideas or events. If you've got a suggestion for me, please drop it in the comments. I'm always looking for y'all's feedback. If you want to keep up to date with my latest videos, go ahead and click that subscribe button below, and if you're a freak, you can even click the bell icon for notifications. Alright, without further ado, let's get this shit show on the road. First, I'd like to clarify that Diamat is a conjunction of two crusty philosophical terms, dialectical and materialism, and not the chaotic dragon goddess from D&D, pronounced by somebody with a bad head cold. Already, I probably lost you with those two $5 words, but they really do mean something, believe it or not. Just something very specific and a little abstract. I'm sure you can understand them though, so let's break them down. Let's start with the term dialectical. First, we can chop off the AL ending. That just means relating to the dialectic. Okay, so what's the dialectic? Well, if you're familiar with the word dialect, meaning a distinctive way of speaking a language like the New York and New Jersey dialects, you're already basically halfway there. The dialectic, or dialectics, is a field of philosophy that views things as interacting with each other like a conversation between two people. One person says something, the other person responds, and together they build a conclusion out of the two, possibly opposite, points of view. This goes way back in Western history, all the way back to the ancient Greeks, who loved to think about philosophy through the lens of dialectics while they were fondling femboy twinks. Look it up. They loved that shit. Anyways, dialectics was for a long time thought about as literally two people talking to each other. But eventually some old German guy named Georg Hegel realized that the ways people thought could be viewed through that lens too. One philosophy would come around, and then another would come around as a response to it, and they would engage with one another until they came together into something new. The first philosophy could be thought of as a statement, or a thesis. That would mean that the one that comes around as a response to it would be an anti-statement, or an antithesis. And the process that Hegel was really interested in was how the thesis and antithesis would interact with one another for a while, before basically meeting somewhere in the middle and settling the argument. This can be thought of as the two statements coming together into a new conclusion, which you could call the synthesis. Then, that synthesis would become the only statement that there is, meaning that inevitably another anti-statement, or antithesis, would come up, and the process would repeat again, so on and so forth throughout time. This kind of shows us the evolution of ideas, and if you had the patience, or masochism, to sit through a history of Western philosophy, you'd see that this was the exact process that philosophy took throughout history, starting in the distant past with the femboy twinks, and evolving all the way up to the modern femboy twinks today by using this process. That's dialectics. Okay, cool. A little abstract, but I think I got it. What about the materialist part, though? Does that mean that they're obsessed with getting the newest Gucci bag? No, sorry. The materialism part is where we go from the realm of old crusty white dudes circle jerking about ancient Greek philosophy, and into the realm of old crusty white dudes circle jerking about how capitalism must be destroyed, and the only thing we have to lose is our chains. Materialism, in this sense, means that the dialectical process we described earlier is driven mostly by the actual circumstances that people are living in, reality. See, Hegel's dialectics were idealist, meaning that he thought the statements, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis that were involved were just kind of thought into existence. People just made them up, basically. But Marx thought that didn't make sense. I mean, I don't know about you, but most of what I think about in my life isn't just some random bullshit that has nothing to do with my actual life. I think about the problems that I have in real life, the solutions, and the suggestions that I get from other people. That's what forms my perspective on life. That idea, that people generally think and act about what they're faced with in real life, and not just like some random bullshit they pull out of their ass, is materialism. And that's where we draw the line between Hegel's dialectics and Marx's dialectics, or between idealist dialectics and materialist dialectics. Using the framework of materialist dialectics, we'll use the term Diamat from here on out, by the way. Marx and his sugar daddy Engels were actually able to understand a lot more than than just the progress of ideas. The same basic process happens in many parts of human existence, but the part that got them in hot water with the authorities was their observation that Diamat also explained the political and economic development of human society. That's a big claim, so let's take a closer look to make sure I'm not feeding you a line of BS. Okay, so as we all know, humans began as hunter-gatherers, basically just wandering around and finding what they needed to not starve to death. There really wasn't anything left over after getting the food that we needed, so there wasn't really a system for portioning out those extra resources and the work used to make them. That is very basically what an economy is, after all, a system for portioning resources and assigning work. That changed when we settled down and started farming for food though. Then, because farming is kind of an OP food making strategy, we suddenly had a bunch of extra food left over, and we could afford to have a whole group of people that didn't have to farm or hunt. Bingo bango, we've got classes of people. One class that does the work, and the other class that doesn't. The people that didn't do the work at this time were mostly kings, warriors, priests, and basically everyone that made up the ancient state. Not state like New York, but a state like the USA. This is going to be our thesis. Over time, because most people don't like having to do backbreaking labor in the fields for the benefit of somebody who does nothing for them, the state began to start capturing and forcing people to do it. There's a word for that, I think. Slavery. There's our antithesis. Now, the term that Marx came up with to refer to the thesis and antithesis when talking about economic and political systems is a mode of production. It's another $5 phrase that just means the arrangement of classes in a society and how those classes relate to the economy. As you might expect, the ancient mode of production that had a bunch of slaves in it is called the ancient or slave mode of production. This system lasted for a long time. In Europe, basically until about the time that the Western Roman Empire fell. At that point, the ancient mode of production was starting to hit its limits, due in large part to the fact that all the slaves that were doing everything, one, didn't like being slaves, big surprise, I know, and two, literally couldn't keep up with all the people that needed to be fed now that the state was so big that it covered an entire subcontinent. Europe is not a continent, that's just Eurocope. Before we move on to talk about the next step in the process, let's take a step back and look at the mode of production that we've got here. In a very simplified form, we've got two main classes, one of slaves and one of slave masters. As you might have expected, these two classes didn't exactly see eye to eye. In crusty terms, they had different material incentives, or in English, they both wanted different things. The slaves wanted to not be slaves, and the slave masters wanted their slaves to shut the fuck up and do as they're told. The two classes were pitted against each other in perpetual conflict. They were also wildly disproportionate, with slaves vastly outnumbering their masters. This is not exactly a recipe for stability. Luckily, the slave masters were also the ones that controlled the state, and more importantly, the army. So when the slaves started getting a little too uppity, asking for like human rights or some other blue hair bullshit, the slave owners could always send in the army to butcher them until they stopped complaining. That seems like a textbook example of oppression, right? Not really a better word for it than that. Just keep that in the back of your mind for later, Habibi. Back to the history. So, though the fall of the Roman Empire was complicated and still not reducible to a single event, the changes that brought the ancient mode of production to an end are 1. Declining agricultural yields due to a changing climate, 2. A lack of complete control by the state over the army, and 3. A central state that was far too large to adequately respond to issues across the empire because it took weeks to get news from Rome to the frontiers. Because of these reasons, among others, the slave master class had grown too large to be fed by the slaves, and the loyal parts of the army and the state were stretched too thin to force the slaves to do what they needed them to do. So, in a very abstract way, you could say that the thesis, the slave master state, and the antithesis, the slaves, were in conflict, and due to external circumstances, the slave master state was no longer able to keep the slaves suppressed, and perhaps more importantly, unable to feed themselves with the extra resources produced by the slaves. So what happened? Well, the thesis and the antithesis came together to create a new synthesis. This was serfdom, a system partway between slavery and freedom. Slave masters gave their slaves freedom, kind of, and the slaves agreed to be locked into a new subservient class of serfs. Now, in the year of our Lord 2025, we might not quite get the difference between slavery and serfdom, but the basic distinction is that serfs are tied to the land that they live on, which is then owned by a local king or lord, while the slaves are tied to their master wherever they go. Serfs also had like 1 or 2 rights, nothing like what we enjoy today, but still definitely better than slavery. This new system of serfdom, controlled by kings and lords who owned the land, was the new synthesis. Europe was now out of the ancient mode of production and had built the feudal mode of production. Now we've got a political and economic system that actually looks pretty similar to the last one, but with a couple of important differences. There were still 2 big classes of people, one small one that controlled the state and the army and lived lives of unimaginable luxury, and one large one that did all of the work, got oppressed by the state state and the army, and lived in poverty and squalor. While it was all much better than the absolute hell that was the slave mode of production, it still wasn't a great place to live. It still had the same contradictions between the two classes, one might say. The two classes still struggled against one another, if you're picking up what I'm putting down. Both modes of production are what's called class societies, where two main classes exist in a constant conflict with each other, and that class conflict is what drives the changes within the mode of production. In the ancient mode of production, the conflict was slaves versus their masters. In the feudal one, it's serfs versus their lords. Simple as. Now, I'm sure you know where I'm going to go from here. The feudal mode of production lasted for a while, with the lordly class and the serf class in perpetual conflict. As this happened, however, there were some interesting changes brewing. Some incredibly racist Italian guy stumbled ass backwards into a couple of continents that had actually been discovered 3 times before by the native inhabitants, Polynesians, and Leif Erikson. But he did what they hadn't done before, and began immediately mass murdering the natives and stealing their land for the King of Spain, who had paid for his trip across the Atlantic. His name was like Carl Colum or something? Don't know, don't care. What matters is that this discovery and subsequent land theft vastly enriched the King of Spain, and so he, and every other king in Europe, naturally started sending merchants and bloodthirsty murderers to go plunder what had then come to be known as the quote-unquote New World. While much of these stolen resources of course ended up in the hands of the lordly class in Europe, it also of course lined the pockets of the merchants that were transporting it to and from that New World. And it began to accumulate, making these merchants more and more powerful. Just a quick side note, because we haven't mentioned merchants until now. They've always existed, obviously. They were just never very numerous or powerful, and kind of a footnote in the development of Diamat until now. In the feudal mode of production, they even formed guilds and trade organizations like the Hanseatic League, and held very local power, all while the lordly class still really controlled European society because of their control over the state and the army. But all of that was about to change. As the stolen resources gained from plundering and murdering millions of innocent people in the Americas and Africa piled up in the bank accounts of the merchants, they began to see ways they could make even more money by breaking the laws and restrictions that their kings put on trade. You see, at this time, the kings didn't want people trading with foreigners willy-nilly. There were very strict regulations on who you could trade with and what you could trade, because the king wanted to make sure that at the end of the day, his kingdom had all the money and the good stuff. Bada bing, bada boom. Here's our antithesis. The new conflict was now between the lordly class and the class of wealthy merchants, both of whom wanted control over the economy so they could benefit themselves at the expense of the other. Or both classes acted according to their own material incentives, which were contradictory, causing them to struggle against one another. This tug of war went back and forth for a few centuries, with the merchants, who now like to call themselves business owners, or more pretentiously, the bourgeoisie, growing more and more powerful over time thanks to the unimaginable horrors they and their cronies inflicted on the indigenous people of the Americas. Eventually, the business owner class got fed up being told with what they can and can't do all the time by some lazy inbred locked up in a castle somewhere, and they began to do something about it. In the late 1700s, the French business owners rallied the normal people, who were at this point in various stages of serfdom or peasantry, against the ruling lordly classes and killed their king. What came after was a big fucking mess, and I'll spare you the details, but in short, the revolutionaries were split along 2 lines. The normal people, who wanted to build a world where everyone was given equal billing, and the bourgeoisie, who wanted to build a world where they had all the money and power, and the common people would shut the fuck up and get back to work. While the common people were, of course, far more numerous than the business owners, and also morally correct, the business owners were far more wealthy and influential, so I'll let you take a wild stab at who won this conflict. While this first French Revolution was a bitter failure, these exact same sort of revolutions kept popping up all over Europe, and eventually the business owners won in basically all of Europe. In some places, they murdered or exiled their king and became republics, and in other places they just cucked the king, but kept him around for decoration. But either way, eventually the business owners were given the levers of power. In return, they allowed the kings and lords to become business owners themselves, just with shiny hats. They both then embarked on the building of a new synthesis, hand in hand working to change the mode of production from the old feudal mode into a new, modern, capitalist mode of production. One of the first things they had to do to kickstart capitalism was called the enclosure of the commons, or the creation of what we refer to as private property today. You see, in the feudal mode of production, the land belonged to the king, but common people were allowed to use some of it to graze animals, grow food, and other boring shit like that. But now, that very same land was fenced off and had a sign that said, "Private property, keep out," enforced by a platoon of thugs with guns. So what were the common people to do? Well, nobody at the time really gave a shit about them, because why would you care about your fellow man? So they had to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and start a business. Just kidding. They didn't have vast piles of money made from plundering Africa and the Americas, so they couldn't do that. Instead, they were forced to move to the cities and get a job working for the business owners. And here we are, our newest, greatest antithesis yet, the noble proletariat. Now we can really talk about the capitalist mode of production, with its 2 classes of people with conflicting interests, one small one that controlled the state and army and lived lives of unimaginable unimaginable luxury, and one large class that did all of the work, got oppressed by the state and the army, and was forced to live in poverty and squalor. What progress we've made. Now, this theory of history that I've outlined from hunter-gatherer society up to roughly 1900 is overall called historical materialism. Or you could call it history that is factual and based on the observation of reality, rather than pulled out of someone's ass somewhere. But inside of it, you can see the operation of dialectical materialism, Diamat, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This is the theoretical core of Marxism, and it's why Marxists advocate for working class revolution. You see, just like the business owners rose up and threw off the yoke of the feudal system for making their own new and better system, the working class too will inevitably rise up and throw off the yoke of the capitalist system. The thesis inevitably causes the rise of the antithesis, who inevitably destroys the thesis and merges with it, becoming a new synthesis. Right, so what we've discussed until now has more or less been Marx's original theory of Diamat that he presented in Das Kapital, his magnum opus. But Engels continued his work after Marx died, and argued that Diamat is much more than just a theory of societal development. Engels, who was writing a few decades after Darwin published On the Origin of Species, applied Diamat to all of evolution. He saw humans and nature as forming a dialectical relationship, along with a whole host of other things. Don't worry, Engels' view of Diamat will get its own video eventually, but today we must keep moving. In addition to expanding the scope of Diamat, Engels also wrote about the 3 laws that he distilled from patterns he noticed throughout history, or carried over from Hegel's previous idealist dialectics. First, the law of the transformation of quantity into quality, and vice versa. That's a lot of fancy words. Let's break it down. Quantity, you got the amount of stuff. Quality, you also got the kind of stuff. What Engels is saying here is that quantitative changes provide the basis or possibility of qualitative changes in a given system. Let's look at an example. A flower sprouts from a seed and begins to grow. As it does so, it adds to the quantity of mass that it is made of. This continues basically the same for a while until it's time to bloom. The flower can only bloom once it has reached a certain size and age, because it needs the various parts of the flower to be present before it can create a bloom. Then, once the flower has reached a certain quantity of mass, it can go through the qualitative shift of blooming, changing its own character. Does that make sense? Let's look at another example, just in case. In a revolutionary movement, there is a very long period of increasing the quantity of people involved. All revolutions need a large group of people to actually do the revolution. Only once the movement has reached critical mass can it successfully take the step of a qualitative change, or doing the actual revolution. Next, Engels talked about the interpenetration, or unity, of opposites. This one is a little easier to wrap your head around, luckily. Within dialectics, the thesis and the antithesis are 2 sides of the same coin. There are no slaves without slave masters. There are no lords without serfs, and there are no workers without business owners. As you might have already guessed, you can think about the synthesis as being made of a thesis and antithesis itself, because it literally is. The whole is divisible in 2, and 2 always combine to become 1. It is the constant contradiction, or struggle, between these 2 parts that causes the whole to move and change. It was the conflict between the slaves and their masters that ended the slave system. It was the conflict between business owners and kings that ended the feudal system. And it will be the conflict of workers and business owners that will end capitalism. Importantly though, when workers end capitalism, they won't destroy it and completely replace it. It will be created from capitalism. The thesis and antithesis will be incorporated into a new synthesis. If this sounds a little like the Taijitu, the yin-yang for my fellow melanin-challenged monkeys out there, it's because that is essentially the same concept. Lastly, we've got the law of the negation of the negation. This is a fancy way of saying that one thing often produces its opposite. The business owners produced the working class. The lords of the feudal system created the business owners, so on and so forth. You'll notice though that this doesn't usually happen in the sense that one completely destroys the other. The feudal lords weren't all mass executed by the business owners. They were incorporated into the new system as a part of the business owners, and mostly allowed to keep their shiny hats, as long as they didn't go against the new system. This process, where the former thesis is changed and pulled into the new synthesis, is called sublation. This is the process that generally sets up the new system for the negation of the negation. For example, capitalism, as we all well know, consolidates industries into monopolies, bringing control over the entire industry into one unified system owned by a capitalist. But this sets up its own negation, because after the revolution, the working class won't break up the monopolies, it will simply sublate them, or take the pre-existing monopoly and make it a socialist monopoly, in service of the workers rather than the capitalist. The capitalist thesis set up its own negation in the form of monopoly, and then the working class antithesis sublates and incorporates it into the new synthesis. That was a lot, so let's recap real quick. We talked about dialectical materialism materialism as a theory of history and a lot of other things, where the two opposites, the thesis and antithesis, conflict with each other before eventually coming together into a new synthesis. That synthesis then becomes the new thesis, and a new antithesis emerges to oppose it. Then we looked at that process taking place throughout history and how it works in a political and economic sense. Then we looked at Engels' 3 laws, the transformation of quantity into quality, which describes how within Diamat changes in number eventually add up into changes in type. The second law was the unity of opposites, which describes how within Diamat, 2 opposites form one larger whole, and every whole is reducible into 2 opposites. And finally, we looked at the law of the negation, which describes how a thesis creates the circumstances that creates its own antithesis. And when the antithesis gains control, it builds off of what the thesis has created with its own interests in mind through the process of sublation. This is where it takes parts of the thesis and twists them off to its own benefit, creating a new system that is a mixture of the older thesis and antithesis, called the synthesis. Then, that synthesis eventually creates a new antithesis that opposes it, and the whole process begins again. Okay, now that I've hammered 4,200 words of Marxist theory into your head, let's take a quick step back and look at another example, partly to clarify all the jargon that I've thrown at you, and partly to provide proof of what I know is a huge claim. So far, we've looked at Diamat at play in the realm of history, and hinted at Engels' much larger application of that idea. But let's take a second look at Diamat as it played out in human politics, which is actually what we're here to talk about after all. Throw back to the 1500s in Italy, where the Catholic Church was one half of the political structure that shaped society at the time. The other was, of course, kings and queens, who were made legitimate by the blessing of the church. Basically, the reason people listened to the king is because the church told them that God put the king in charge. For roughly 1,000 years by this point, the monarchy and the Catholic Church had based their authority on the fact that they were both the earthly manifestations of God, and part of the reason people believed that is because they had all of the answers about when, where, how, and why the world was created. These answers, believe it or not, came from the Bible, where it claimed that the earth was 6,000 years old, and also the center of the universe. This idea, that everything in the solar system rotated around the earth, is called geocentrism. This situation, where the Catholic Church combined with monarchy as a political structure helps to regulate, control, and structure society based on the claims of the Bible, is our thesis. A fundamental part of that thesis is the belief that we touched on earlier, that the Earth is the center of the solar system, because the reason people believed the church in the first place is because it's the only institution that can answer these big questions, like where the Earth came from and how the solar system works. Well, in the 1500s in Italy, the merchant classes were becoming more and more powerful and wealthy, thanks to the ongoing plunder of the Americas and Africa. Part of the reason that these merchant classes were able to do this plundering in the first place is because they followed scientific, or materialist, incentives. Columbus made money from the Spanish king by pursuing scientific knowledge when he stumbled into the Americas. Obviously, the Spanish king did too, and suddenly, royalty across Europe could make a bunch of money by hiring scientists to do science, and boy did they. In pursuing their own material interests, making money, the royalty created a group of people who pursued their own material interests, made money by doing science. Into this whole context comes a guy you might have heard of by the name of Galileo. He was one of these scientists who made their money by doing science, but when he made a telescope and looked at the sky, he was able to observe that the Earth was in fact not the center of the solar system. As the name might imply, the sun is the center of the solar system. The word for that is heliocentrism. And bingo bango, we got our antithesis. Real quick, let's pause and note that the thesis, a church and monarchy based on geocentrism, was formed by pursuing what benefited it. Basically, by claiming that the church had a monopoly on answering these big questions, it created and pushed the idea of geocentrism. But the other half of the political structure, the monarchy, was pursuing their own material incentives, making themselves money, when they started paying scientists to do science. And so those scientists, together with Galileo and his idea of heliocentrism, is our antithesis. The thesis created the antithesis through the interaction of 2 contradictory parts within it pursuing their own material incentives. And that thesis and antithesis contradicted each other. Either geocentrism is correct or heliocentrism is. They cannot be reconciled. But the contradiction between the church and science was resolved in the end. How did that happen? Well, long, violent story short, if you ask most Catholics today, you would come to find that they do indeed support heliocentrism, which has been proven objectively correct in the centuries since then. But also the Catholic Church, and even many monarchs who trace their original claim to legitimacy to the blessing of the Catholic Church, both still exist. Take a wild guess at what this new status quo is called in Diamat's words. That's right, the synthesis. If you ask most Catholics today, they still believe that God created the earth, and they still believe that humans have a special place in God's creation. They just don't believe the explicit claim that the earth is the literal center of the universe. Neither does the church itself, actually. The church is now heliocentric, and that's our synthesis. Even better though, we can look at how that synthesis was formed. The Catholic Church incorporated heliocentrism into itself, using the process called sublation. The thesis incorporated part of the antithesis into itself, and that created our modern synthesis. Great, now there is no confusion whatsoever, and we're all 100% clear. We can get to the main reason I'm actually making this video: Mao Zedong. My next video is going to be on his work on contradiction, which goes over in large part his view of Diamat and the changes that he made to the previous form of Diamat that we just talked about. That's right, baby. This entire very complicated video wasn't even the modern view of Diamat. It was the view we had in the 1920s. But you have to know that part in order to vaguely understand what Mao is talking about in this section. So, without further ado, let's see what the fuck Mao is talking about. First, Mao disagreed with Engels saying that there are 3 laws. He thought that the only real law in Diamat was the unity of opposites, and that the other 2, the negation of the negation and the law of transformation of quantity into quality, were merely tendencies that were downstream effects of the unity of opposites. We'll go into much more detail in my next video, so don't worry if you're still a bit confused. That wasn't the end of his changes though. He also added a couple more ideas intended to give us a little higher resolution view of the way that Diamat works. We talked about the contradictions between thesis and antithesis, and also about how each thesis is itself made from a thesis and antithesis that have been synthesized together. So we can see that in any specific thesis-antithesis system, there are multiple contradictions at play. But how do we decide which one is the most important at the time? Well, this is where Mao's ideas came in, giving us the concept of the principal contradiction, or the idea that one contradiction is more important than another in a given situation. More than that though, because all syntheses are divisible into thesis and antithesis, Mao also outlined the concept of the principal aspect of a contradiction, meaning the part of a single contradiction that is playing the more important role within that contradiction at that time. Again, we're going to go into far more detail in my next video, so don't worry if you're not quite following that. Basically, what Mao did is take this method of dialectical materialism that's allowed us to explain these big historical developments, like the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and zoomed in, giving us a framework for looking very specifically at smaller, more immediate parts of the process. Before him, Diamat showed us the big, centuries-long march of history, but he looked at the littler, faster movements that are going on around us all the time, and analyzed how those small changes built up over time into the bigger ones that we've already talked about. If that sounds interesting or useful, make sure you tune in next time when we'll be talking about one of Mao's most influential works, On Practice and Contradiction. For now though, keep it radical. If you're new to this, let me know how I did. Does this make any sense at all, or are you more confused than you were before? If you're old to this, let me know what you think I missed, and leave your reading recommendations in the comments. If you've somehow made it to the end of this monster video, and would like to see more communist content, please negate the algorithm's distaste for progressive revolutionary content by liking and subscribing, and maybe tossing a link or two to a bud, preach. Lastly, but most importantly, it has been made solely for educational and entertainment purposes, and the creator does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the accuracy, applicability, fitness, or completeness of the content within. Please don't hurt me.